Okay. So we are now recording. Thank you so much for joining us for a NASIC webinar that is sponsored by NASIC Continuing Education Committee and NASIC Equity and Inclusion Committee. It isn't part of our language self-naming and Indigenous people in library data. We will let our wonderful presenters to introduce themselves, but before that, some logistics information. It is recorded. We will share the recording with everybody who attended and registered. The information about this and other NASIC webinars is available on the NASIC website. NASIC webinars recordings are also posted on NASIC YouTube channel. There is a 3-month embargo, and after 3 months, all NASIC webinars are available to everybody. Our next webinar is coming to terms with enhancing reparative change in an urban library OPEC. It's on May 15 at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. It's also free for NASIC members and NASIC student members and NISO members. So if you haven't registered already, please go ahead and register. This next webinar will be our last webinar for this year, and then we will resume having more webinars probably in August or September. And before we'll get started, I'll let Charlene talk a little bit about Equity and Inclusion Committee.
Hi, my name is Sherilyn Swenson, and I am the chair of the Equity and Inclusion Committee. We are very excited to sponsor a webinar about Indigenous people and anything involving equity and inclusion. So if you have any ideas or things that you want to hear, people you want to hear from, please feel free to contact our committee, and you can see the contact information on the NASIC homepage. And so now we'll start with Lord, and you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm just, I had minimized things and now I need to maximize some things so I can find my share button. Hang on. Okay. Is the right slide showing?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. So I am Laura Daniels. I'm the Director of Cataloging and Metadata at Cornell University Library.
And I'm Stephen Folsom, Head of Metadata Design and Operations. As far as my involvement with this work, you'll hear more about that as we progress through the slides. So I think that's enough for now.
So I will start with just reminding people, if you didn't know what you were signing up for, the Haudenosaunee people, the people of the Longhouse, are a confederacy of 6 sovereign nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. And all the names I just read are other names, anglicized forms of their autonym or self-names. Cornell University, where Stephen and I work, is located on the unceded land of the Cayuga Nation. Thus, this name used for these people in Cornell's library catalog is of particular concern to us. So today, this presentation is based on a book chapter with the same title that appeared in Inclusive Cataloging, Philosophical Questions and Case Studies in Reparative Cataloging. We will describe the thought process and methods we use to engage with Haudenosaunee leaders to facilitate self-naming in Library of Congress subject headings. And we will also today get to talk about what's happened since the chapter was published, including forthcoming and ongoing changes to Library of Congress's guidelines and approaches to representing Indigenous peoples. First, I'll start with a land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with an historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. And this land acknowledgement has been reviewed and approved by the traditional Gayacono leadership. In addition to the Gayacono land acknowledgement, but separate from it, the Cornell American Indian and Indigenous Studies faculty would like to emphasize that Cornell's founding was enabled in the course of a national genocide by the sale of almost 1 million acres of stolen Indian land under the Morrill Act of 1862. To date, the university has neither officially acknowledged its complicity in this theft, nor has it offered any form of restitution to the hundreds of Native communities impacted. So I am really grateful for this opportunity to talk today about our work and to talk with Stephen about it and be able to go into some more detail than we were able to do in the book chapter. So I'd like to begin with a little bit of background about where I came to this work from. So I've been a cataloger for many years, and I was someone for whom, when I was quite young, the Library of Congress classification scheme just, quote, made sense to me. And I really had not examined what that meant until I was introduced during the course of some classes I was taking at the University of Washington iSchool to writings of Marissa Duarte and Miranda Velarde Lewis, and one of their articles is where this image is from. Also Sandy Littletree, Cheryl Metoyer, Linda Tuhiwai Smith, among many, many others. And I began to see the bounds and limits of my own worldview and how that influenced my approach to my work as a cataloger. I'd really like to thank Dr. Sandy Littletree in particular for being very patient with me as a student who started out in the Indigenous Systems of Knowledge class. I started out as a student thinking that I was going to figure out how to map a classification system like Brian Deere to Library of Congress. And it took at least a few weeks for me to realize that this sort of exercise would be about as possible or meaningful as mapping a musical score to the Latin alphabet. They are two completely different worldviews, approaches to knowledge, and there is no translation between the two. More specifically of interest to this presentation, during the course of these readings and this coursework, I became aware of the importance in many Indigenous cultures of oral knowledge. And I will talk a little bit later about how this surfaces, particularly when approaching the research and justification that we do for terms chosen as Library of Congress subject headings. The map you see in this image is from the Library of Congress's collection, and it illustrates that back in 1720, we actually did have written documentation of a version of the name of this people. And it also serves as a reminder to me that their democracy long preceded the existence of a country that we now call the United States. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was actually originally 5 nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. And the Tuscarora Nation, I often hear, joined later, but when we say later, we mean in the early 18th century, actually around the time that this map was made. And at that point, they became the 6 nations. Haudenosaunee can be translated as people of the Longhouse, or more literally, they are house builders, or perhaps more accurately, people building the Longhouse. And the focus in the name is not on the house itself, as we might tend to think, but rather on the building of it together. And if you're interested in hearing more about this, we link in our resources to a short PBS video that talks about this. So the term Iroquois, which is the Library of Congress subject heading currently, well, technically it's Iroquois Indians, for the Haudenosaunee people, was never used by any of the people in the 6 nations. And while the origins are sometimes disputed, it is clearly an Anglicized version of a Frenchified version of a term used by other peoples, most likely derogatorily. This was never their name, and when European settlers decided to refer to them this way, it was simply incorrect.
Right. So some more background on where Laura and I are coming from. So in the last 10 years or so, there have been an increasing number of efforts regionally to recognize the continued presence of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in central New York, where we are, and acknowledge the negative effects of our colonial settler history. And so some examples of this include land acknowledgements becoming a norm. Here on the screen, you see bilingual road signage from our town, and we see it showing up, or this type of bilingual road signage increasingly throughout the region. Another notable event or development was in 2019, the Tompkins County Center for History and Culture opened a heritage tourism center with festivities, including exhibits and panel discussions to raise awareness here in our town about the Gayacono of this region. And then within our library, we had a digitization effort in partnership with the Cornell Department of Anthropology, including a process of repatriation of materials back to the Seneca Nation. And then more personally, for as Laura stated, she's been doing coursework and on Indigenous systems of knowledge and became more aware of the surrounding issues around settler naming of Indigenous people. For me personally, like hitting home literally, the Ithaca City School District has incorporated anti-marginalization efforts into its curriculum. And in 2020, when I was working from home while my children were still in an elementary school, I happened upon, I was attending third grade, let's be honest. And 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 there was a virtual school lesson on the Haudenosaunee that made me aware, as Laura pointed out, that Iroquois likely originated from French colonizers as an interpretation of a derogatory term from the Huron Nation. And so that led me to wonder, well, how do we handle the Haudenosaunee, or how do we uh, mention, or how does Haudenosaunee show up in our catalog? And so the first thing I did was a keyword search of Haudenosaunee in our catalog. And um, for a brief second, I was pleased that there were results coming from the keyword searching. And until I realized 270, really, we must have more than that. And so with the next slide, I attempted a search for Iroquois in our catalog, and we see over 1,300. Um, and a little bit about our catalog. The way our catalog leverages LCSH is that when an established authority heading is used in a bibliographic record, any variant headings on that authority are also searchable values within our record. So in theory, if LCSH had Iroquois or Haudenosaunee as the established heading and the other as a variant, our results would for searching either term should be relatively the same. But as these last two slides have pointed out, that's dramatically not true. And so it was the first sign that we might want to improve LCSH treatment for Haudenosaunee. Um, and so here's an example of a record that uses the established headings from LCSH. And so part of the problem that so I just talked about recall and how one might search and be able to confidently bring back everything about the Haudenosaunee. But we also see here that the established preferred heading, I'm doing air quotes here, is for Iroquois Indians. And so to summarize, not only does this preferred heading not use the endonym or the self name, uh, LCSH centers the settler name in our record display. And users can't confidently search by Haudenosaunee because there isn't a variant uh, label in the LCSH. And I couldn't help myself. I just kept reading this record. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is that when the book itself is wrestling with the endonym self-naming issue. The book is titled Iroquois, or I don't even know how to say it because it's not even pronounced, or it's not even spelled like we traditionally see the word Iroquois. But the publisher note refers to the people as Haudenosaunee. We see it littered throughout this screenshot. And this isn't a surprising finding necessarily in that present day actors, even those who want to center endonyms, are navigating the prominence of settler histories in modern language, economy. Um, I use this word loosely, but like brand recognition. Like if somebody's trying to sell a book for to people who either know the name or the the prominence of settler histories makes it important to a publisher maybe to include the weird word Iroquois to get the broadest audience. And so you'll see this um, in the writings, in your conversations with with people throughout the process where everybody's sort of jumping back and forth between settler language and self-naming. So, and then the next slide is a little bit more of that. So the chapters themselves use the name Haudenosaunee, and a cataloger at some point decided to drop the Iroquois and have an alternate title that speaks directly to Haudenosaunee. So we see this tension in this one record encapsulates all that tension.
I need to remember to unmute. I'm going to go under the hood a little, and in the next few slides, I'll talk about the differences between the subject headings, demographic and group terms, and name authorities for the Haudenosaunee in cataloging. These examples highlight how the three different vocabularies represent the same people completely differently, which contributes to the dissonance that Stephen illustrated in our public catalog. So LCSH, Library of Congress subject headings. The guidelines and principles for establishing these subject headings rely primarily on and really privilege written reference resources. So this conflicts with the Indigenous reliance on and preference for oral knowledge that I talked about earlier. And it also ignores the reality that published reference sources have historically been created from a Western settler perspective. So this means that the names for peoples, such as the Haudenosaunee, were taken from documents written about them rather than resources created by them. I am very happy to say that I see this approach shifting, and Library of Congress now considers it important to research, document, and give preferences to terms used by the groups themselves to define a group. LC demographic group terms, or LCDGT, are intended to describe creator and audience characteristics, and they cannot be used as subjects. This is a newer vocabulary than LCSH, though, and the guidelines for research and authoritative sources still rely heavily on published and textual resources, but you can see that in LCDGT, the Haudenosaunee are notably Haudenosaunee, not Iroquois, and also North American people, not Indians. And that to me is huge. Spoiler alert, when I made a subject proposal, I just could not bring myself to say Haudenosaunee Indians. And that's part of why this work has taken us so long. So finally, the Library of Congress name authority file, in which the Haudenosaunee people are the Six Nations, because as we mentioned earlier, they are comprised of 6 nations. Unlike LC subject headings and demographic group term vocabularies, the name authority file can be updated directly by libraries who are members of the NACO program, the Name Authority Cooperative. So these change more frequently and with less rigidity. Also, very importantly, the name authority for the Six Nations represents them as an agency as opposed to them as a people. So just like the United States represents the government, not necessarily the US people, LCSH currently, the people who live in the US, well, it's complicated. You could say we're called Americans. Actually, we can only be called Americans in LCSH if we're in other countries. But the difference is between the people themselves and the government representing the people as an agency. So the fact that this name is different isn't as problematic in my mind. And you can see also Haudenosaunee Confederacy is a variant. But another even more important difference between the name authority file and subject authorities is that with name authorities, the preferences of the entity that's being represented always take precedence over any other sources. This is primarily usually a consideration when we're talking about individual humans. But this principle, many of us believe, actually should be applied to subject headings whenever the subject heading represents a group of people or a people. So when Stephen and I decided that this was something we wanted to investigate, before we did anything else, we wanted to get a scope of the work. So we looked at all established Library of Congress subject headings that have the word Iroquois either in the heading itself or in any of the references. And the Library of Congress's tool, ClassWeb, which is what's pictured here, was very useful because it clearly displays and links to broader, narrower, and related terms. So we could be certain that we were getting all the relevant terms that we wanted to consider. So in addition to the main heading itself and the headings for each of the Six Nations, any other related headings will also need to be updated if this term is changed, but not quite all of them. So for example, there are headings like Iroquois language that really needs to be evaluated and addressed separately. And there are various place names or corporate body names, such as the Iroquois National Wildlife Refuge in New York State, which are out of scope. We tracked all of the headings in a spreadsheet, and in all, we identified 50 headings we believe would need updates of some sort.
So in 2021 and 2022, when we were beginning the process of consulting the Six Nations on how they would like to be reflected in LCSH, the LIPA best practices in authority work relating to Indigenous nations of the US hadn't come out yet. But what was really nice to see was that what eventually shows up in that document, we experienced a lot of those considerations as we progress through the work. So I'm talking about what kind of relationships does our institution have with local Indigenous nations? What are the dynamics between different Indigenous nations in our area? Who else might be doing or thought of similar work? And when and where and who to look to for information. One of the things that document now notes is that endonym terminology is now frequently discussed in culture and history sections of Indigenous nation websites. And we found that to be true and helped us along the way. And so that was part of our process consideration was there we were seeing this um, uh, from sites developed by members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and so our approach was almost an attempt to confirm the problem in LCSH, and so that colored our approach. As far as institutional relationships go, we benefited tremendously from Kurt Jordan from the Department of Anthropology and American and Indigenous Studies at Cornell. Kurt or Dr. Jordan's research centers the archaeology of Haudenosaunee people, and his work has shown that empirical evidence provided by archaeology can do much to combat the inaccurate narratives of Indian decline and powerlessness that pervade scholarly and popular writing about Indigenous people of North America. Dr. Jordan has also worked with the Gayakono, the Cayuga people in and around Ithaca, on a variety of community-directed initiatives. And prior to our work on the Haudenosaunee people with Dr. Jordan, he had worked with the library on a digitization collection of an archaeological site of the Onondaga Haudenosaunee, and the structure and the content of that collection were co-designed with the people whose objects are in the digital collection. Dr. Jordan, this was like a really powerful moment for us. It put us in contact with Joe Stallman, the director of the Seneca and Iroquois Nation National Museum, who helped us to consider a protocol for reaching out to individual members of the Six Nations and develop a list of contacts. In that discussion, Dr. Jordan and Joe Stallman gave more context on each person's cultural or leadership position within the nation and the confederacy, and it it was nice to get a confirmation in an early email exchange with Joe, where he mentioned that the museum he directs uses LCSH, and in the past year, so this was like 2021, had noticed the use of Iroquois Indians in LCSH, but didn't have the bandwidth to tackle the problem.
So, as Stephen said, we were starting this work around 2020, 2021, and not surprisingly, the timing and the strategy of our communication was impacted by the pandemic. So all of our communication was necessarily via email. There was no option to go talk to people face to face during those times. We also used Zoom, or in one case, physical mail. At the same time, lots of community members had understandably no capacity to engage with a couple of academic librarians about terms in a library catalog. Working with Dr. Jordan, someone who has such deep and specific knowledge of these people, allowed us to understand, as Stephen said, the dynamics between and among the nations. And it also afforded a really close examination of our language and how it might be read by these particular people. So for example, I remember him saying something like, well, if you say we would like to know, you're implying that you think you know something already. It was also important to me, even though we were pretty sure that Iroquois was not wrong, and it was important to me because and by we, I mean librarians, we got it wrong the first time. So I really didn't want to make any assumptions. I wanted to ask rather than suggesting, and I wanted to be as explicit as possible. So for example, I wanted to say, how do you want to be named in this context of the library catalog? Not just, well, what do you call yourselves? So in our case, the names that would have been given for the answers to both of those questions would have been the same, but we couldn't presume that that would be the case, that what they called themselves would be what they want other people to call them in the context of library data. It was also really important to be transparent around whom we were contacting and what we planned to do with any responses we got. For instance, we had to talk about, what if we get different answers, there's no consensus. We were lucky, there was strong consensus, and also be very clear about what our limitations are. So we are in a position to propose changes to the Library of Congress subject headings, but we don't make those final decisions. This is just some excerpts from the letter that we sent. So for example, we say, we do not believe this is the correct way to refer to your people. We do not assume we know what the best words are. And this was where instead of saying we would like to know, we said, we are hoping you will be willing to advise us. I won't read the whole thing, but I will point also, we had very specific questions, including, is there a best term for libraries to use? And are there terms that we should not be using? And a not sort of anonymized version of this letter is included in the appendix to those best practices and authority work relating to Indigenous nations in the US that Stephen mentioned earlier. And this best practices document was created by members of the LIPA, that's Latin American and Indigenous Peoples of the Americas subject funnel, which you'll hear a little more about shortly.
Yes, and so we sent a sizable number of letters out, but as the LIPA best practices acknowledge, individuals we're contacting may not engage with our projects to improve LCSH for a multitude of reasons. And yet we were still able to confirm Haudenosaunee is preferred over Iroquois. In a meeting with a TPO and cultural advisor of the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin, we got some really great background on why there's consensus, and so in the mid 1970s, a grand council was held at the Onondaga in South Syracuse with various nations of North America, and it was at this time when there were a lot of unity conferences with delegations sent to the World Court in Geneva, and the Grand Council decided to send representatives from each of the six nations, and the since the Onondaga Nation is considered the keeper of the Central Fire, the Six Nations decided, using the Onondaga spelling Haudenosaunee, was a way to show unity and organizing among the nations. It was during this conversation that Bob Brown, the Oneida cultural advisor, stated, it isn't part of our language when we asked about Iroquois. And Bob Brown wanted us to know also that each nation has their own spellings and pronunciations of Haudenosaunee. And so here I want to sort of step back and talk about this idea of self-naming and endonyms. So it's a driving principle of the work, as both Laura and I have stated a couple times now. And I think it's important in this case to understand that endonyms are a name of something, especially a place or a group of people or a language that is used internally in that place or by the people. And while Haudenosaunee is not necessarily a self name, but a name that we found approximates nation member spellings and pronunciations of their endonym. And while it only approximates that, using Haudenosaunee, as you see it here on the screen, shows respect for the people and their nation's sovereignty.
So after we spent a lot of time sending out messages, waiting for responses, getting responses, once we decided we had heard consistently enough, and importantly, as Stephen pointed out, we understood why there was this agreement. We felt confident moving forward with a subject proposal. And during the process of trying to figure out who else might be working on this, I had reached out to the LIPA funnel, and I found out first that nobody else was working on it. I also received significant support and advice from a number of members of that funnel, in crafting the proposal you see that I submitted. And if you are a cataloger, you'll probably find lots of problems with this. I'm aware of them. I have also since become a member, and I'm now a co-coordinator of that funnel. So I initially submitted this change proposal in 2022, and I just submitted the proposal for the main heading, changing Iroquois Indians to Haudenosaunee, North American people. I chose that North American people qualifier based on the demographic and group terms name because I did not think that Indians made any sense at all. So I submitted the proposal with a note saying, well, if this is accepted or if this is going to be considered, there are a lot of other related headings. I may have used the number 50. And then shortly after I submitted that proposal, which was late 2022, then in March 2023, LC issued interim guidelines for Indigenous headings proposals based on the guiding principle, exactly the principle that actually we were already following to ensure consultation with the described communities whenever possible. Those interim guidelines, however, still included the pattern that was prescribed at that time of appending the word Indians to the name of the people. So because I did not follow that pattern, and I knew I wasn't following the pattern, consideration of my proposal was postponed. Around this same time, planning began for what was to become the Indigenous Headings Consultants Group, which was initiated in 2024. And while this group has been reviewing and making proposed changes, some of which were very recently released on tentative list 9G 2025, I'm actually waiting with bated breath for those to come out as approved changes. Proposals such as mine, which did not follow the standard practice of using Indians as part of the name, have been on hold. Also in 2024, Library of Congress decided to formally define a project as a set of 20 or more proposals on a single theme. And so with about 50 subject headings implicated in this, what we have here is definitely a project, and going forward, we will need to address it as such. So what I see is, and this is an excerpt from that tentative list that was the result of the Indigenous Headings Consultants Group. And it wasn't just people putting their heads together and saying, let's do this. They did a whole lot of talking to people. It was not straightforward to decide how to start making these sweeping changes. But I see that the work that we were doing and that other people that we started to talk to were doing seems to have been part of a larger collective shift in how cultural institutions consider and approach terms for Indigenous peoples. So thanks to the work of that consultants group, this first set of broad changes to the overarching LCSH hierarchy has been proposed. So for example, what you see here is the proposal to cancel the subject heading Indians and replace that with Indigenous peoples. This work will allow for proposals like ours that are lower down in that hierarchy and that aren't following the pattern with Indians. It will allow those proposals to be considered. If you are interested in this kind of work, the consultants group is hosting a virtual meeting next week. It's on May 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It is free, but registration is required, and you can find information about it through the link in our resources list to the Indigenous Headings Project webpage. And later, if someone reminds me, I can throw that in chat. I just realized, Stephen, we didn't decide who would talk about future work.
Yeah, you began to allude to it, right?
Yes.
We will have to react to the tentative list change, and it'll be interesting, I think, to see how projects get managed and facilitated through the proposal pipeline. I don't have experience with that, but it would be really interesting to see um all, as you said, all the implicated headings get fixed in one swoop. Um uh I can't remember now with the excerpt of the letter that you shared if this came through, but one of the questions we had as we were reaching out to members of each nation were a set of questions about not only how would you prefer or what is your preference for uh, reflecting Haudenosaunee and LCSH. We were also talking about their individual nations, and so um, Laura, you just talked about the upper part of the hierarchy. There's stuff below the Haudenosaunee um, in LCSH that gets to the various nations, and it would be nice to follow through on that.
It would be, and we didn't, as I recall, we didn't get enough responses from all of the nations to have that information. But we know that people like Dr. Jordan have
Yeah,
already done a lot of this research. And one of the principles in those best practices is to be aware of who else is talking to people so that we're not all going individually to the same people, and they are not having to answer the same questions over and over again. So I think our approach to this might be a little different now that we have a little more context and more contacts.
yeah.
And I also know that at the time I was working on that change proposal, Library of Congress authority files were still limited to Mark 8. And so I didn't even think about trying to orthographically accurately represent a lot of those variants. And since LC has migrated to Folio, they are now able to accommodate UTF-8, which, if I remember correctly, is still not sufficient, but we might be able to do some better representation of the various variants.
Right. And one other thing that sticks out to me in a conversation with, I believe it was the Oneida Nation, was we were getting lots and lots of great information. And over Zoom, it was oral. Like we were being described the text, being described the phonetic way or the pronunciation. And I remember getting back to my desk, or well, my desk was the same place as the place where we had the Zoom call during the pandemic, but just that I didn't have enough in my notes to know how in LCSH to represent, as you're saying, the spellings, the orthography, the diacritics, etc. And so um, uh, it was useful to get that background, but it might be that there's enough literary warrant from people talking about their own people that we can approximate uh, a better reflection of how they pronounce, write their own names. Yeah.
Our last slide is our resources list. And I'm going to right now see if I can, oh, I can't copy. Can I copy the link?
I
I'm not sure.
posted the link, Laura. I
Oh,
did
thank you.
post
Thank
the
you so
link.
much. Thank you so much, because that meeting is, I'm really looking forward to that meeting. I haven't been following chat, so I haven't seen if we have questions.
I'm seeing comments
Oh,
about, yeah,
I'm
First
probably going
Nation.
backwards, but Beth, we stupidly didn't think to ask if we could record those meetings. And I wish we had, exactly for the reasons Stephen mentioned.
Right. The comments about First Nations and people of or North American people. Um,
Yes, we're
Um,
still using North America.
well, I mean, yeah, I think one of the thing I like about North American people is that um, it's uh, I guess it depends on what you're trying to emphasize here. So, First Nations speaks about it sequentially, but one of the things I like about North American people is I read that as present tense. And I think one of the messages we were trying to say is these people still exist and are sovereign nations and so on. So it's if you read in language about the use of the word or research on the use of the word Indians, there even when you talk to uh, uh, Indigenous people of North America, they wrestle with like what is the messaging? Who am I talking to? What is the message that I want them to hear? And so it's a complicated space to figure out. And LCSH forces us to, right?
To
You have,
choose one.
yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And so it's yeah, the uh the heading that you showed that is sort of pending. Um,
Figure out how to get to it.
uh,
This one.
folks, yeah, folks on the call are right to point out like, there,
It's
uh,
not perfect.
it's not perfect. It's
Yeah. And it took,
progress over Indians, but it's not
yeah.
perfect. Yeah,
Well, and we're talking about a large number of very different peoples.
right, right.
And so the idea that we should expect them all to agree on something is preposterous.
What's the 360?
The three,
Sorry.
six, three, oh, individual ethnic groups. Yeah. And I know another a related issue to this is that people from India, who, it would make sense to refer to as Indians, are represented currently in LCSH by East Indians. And so now they have to figure out they can't just change it to Indians because that's the former heading for this. It's a big tangled mess. And yeah, Beth, I have also heard North America referred to as Turtle Island. Um, Sherilyn, I see your hand.
Yep. Um, I have a couple of questions. The first one is the language itself of the Haudenosaunee. How common is it? Is the language spoken among the people still? That's just a general question because I noticed on the signs and things they had the other name.
Mhm.
I don't believe there is a Haudenosaunee language. Each
Right.
nation
Okay,
has their own language, and I think there may be some similarities that they're perhaps what linguists would call the same language family, but they are
right?
distinct languages.
Among each of the nations.
Right.
Yes,
And
Right.
so then the signs had to do with one particular nation.
yes,
Right. In the case of
Okay,
the sign that you saw on slide two or whatever, that's the way the Gayakono refer to themselves. So if you're not familiar, it's what settlers, it's the nation that settlers refer to as the Cayuga Nation. And so that's a self name by the people of this area for themselves. And so it's not from Onondaga Nation. It's from the Gayakono. And so that's a case where it's specific to a place, specific to a people, and letting them uh, determine how that should be reflected in signage. Yeah.
Okay, I noticed that on the subject headings on the variant term for Iroquois Indians, it did not even list the Haudenosaunee as a variant, which I assume is where some of the problems come up in your catalog because they obviously don't cross. And do you know the reason why? And what were the other variants referring to
Oh, can we go
in the
back there?
subject heading?
Oh, in the current one?
Yeah.
Oh, I would have to look. I do know that in the past, a lot of names for Indigenous peoples got taken from I'm going to get the name wrong. It was the list of federally recognized tribes from the US government. But I would have to go back. I didn't consider removing any variants. And I think I did not. I want to, when we get back to this, which I hope is going to be very soon, I really want to look at more potential variants.
Right. Sherilyn, I hadn't even caught that. And um, everything that I've read on the Haudenosaunee and more often I'm reading about the Gayakono because they're the nation I'm living on their unceded land. I tend to read more on the Gayakono, but these variants that um, uh, are on Laura, if you can go to slide 11, I think that's what
Oh,
Sherilyn was.
yep.
I'm not familiar with these, and
No.
so Laura, you may be right. Part of the proposal might be whatever caused us to include these as variants, they're inaccurate or maybe not. Part of it
Yeah,
could be
we should do
yeah. Yeah.
more delving.
Since no one else has a question, I have one last question. That is, do you see that any issues that will come up because the Library of Congress is connected to the legislature or whatever that to Congress that there'll be pushback? Uh, just because where I live, I see that sometimes.
Um, I'm holding my breath. I was actually concerned that the Indigenous Headings Consultation Group would be discontinued, but so far it hasn't been. The LIPA funnel meets monthly now, and often, I'd say every few months, someone from Library of Congress joins us. And of course, the individuals there don't have agency over what they are told they can and cannot do, but there are a lot of really, really good people at the Library of Congress right now who are very supportive of this work. So I am hopeful that it will continue.
Yeah. And maybe a related topic is what we see in the chat around nations
Yeah.
having legal implications um, and I think where that's more likely to play out is as Laura pointed out earlier, we have different vocabularies um, for government bodies versus uh, a name for a people, and so names uh, is I think more in that territory of legality and uh, the government certainly has uh, political relationships with sovereign nations and needs to or that needs to be reflected accurately for themselves in LCSH, or I guess maybe not LCSH. I'm saying LC name authority in this
Right.
case. Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
They are sovereign nations, and in some cases, whether they are federally recognized or not. I'm not aware of any challenges specifically with nations not being federally recognized in our area, but I have heard in the Pacific Northwest, there are a number of nations that are nations and are not federally recognized.
We do have a question in the question and answer section. And does anyone know if there's been any progress on replacing the overarching Indians of North America heading? Even Indigenous peoples of North America would be better.
Actually, I just did this wrong. Let me get back to the slideshow. Sorry, and now I have to go all the way through. That is part of this the tentative list that came out. I think it's a couple months ago now, that proposes, oops, now I've gone too far, replacing Indians. So Indians of North America, I believe, will be replaced by Indigenous Peoples -- United States. Indigenous Peoples will be, I believe, geographically Indigenous Peoples will be geographically subdividable. So Indigenous Peoples America, and I'm not sure if it will be Indigenous Peoples -- North America, but that is the very top level work that's being done right now that has to get completed before the rest of the hierarchy can be addressed. Yeah, it's one snippet. It's one snippet of a long list that's fairly complex, so understandable that you can't see that on this little excerpt on a slide.
We probably have time for one more question. Any last questions?
There's another question on the question and answer. It says, looking at the LCSH and authority records from the perspective of your work with the Haudenosaunee and other First Nations Indigenous peoples, would you say the governance structures that maintain LCSH are generally sound? Do you find this work challenges the whole artifact if the methodology changes for a subset of the subject headings? It's a hard question to frame. Apologies in advance. I just see a lot of tension here methodologically that could be used to decolonize the methodologies for other parts of the authority subject heading corpus and libraries.
That is such a great question, and I'd like an hour to very, very briefly. I think anytime we are forcing ourselves to choose one term, one label to represent a concept, or I'll just say a concept, there are going to be flaws. But I'm given hope. I know I will misremember exactly what she said. I'm paraphrasing Melanie Paluda from the Library of Congress maybe 6 months ago when she was talking to us about what she was pretty sure the approach was going to be is she was saying, okay, we're not going to have these standardized ways where we have to structure the Indigenous people's names. So if we consider what they prefer instead of trying to have this have a pattern, we will necessarily end up with inconsistencies, and we will just be consistently inconsistent. It's a different guiding principle than the pattern. And I suppose you could say that introduces other problems with what people can expect to see and how people might expect to search. But I think going back to Ranganathan, the library is a living organism. Our vocabularies are living, and they are slow to change, but they have to keep changing. And I do have hope that there are a lot of people at the Library of Congress who seem pretty invested in substantive improvements to the controlled vocabularies and in a more community engagement and contribution to those controlled vocabularies, even though they are maintained by an organization that is responsible to the federal government.
Well, we are at time. We are 1 minute over. Thank you so very much for our wonderful presenters. It was very, very fascinating. I hope you'll consider coming back once you continue with your work. Please join us next week for our other webinar on reparative cataloging. There will be a survey link when you close the presentation, and I'm also posting it in chat here. So please give us your feedback on this program, or if you have ideas for other programs, please share those with us as well. And thank you very, very much again. It was really, really lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.